Good morning, everybody. What a pleasure to be addressing you. I want to do three things today. Firstly, try and persuade you to be foxes rather than hedgehogs in this volatile climate. Secondly, look a bit at the global economy and what the future scenarios are over the next 5 years, and then talk a little bit about South Africa and the possibilities here. I guess the story starts in the year 2000 when I met, one of South Africa's best futurists, Chantal Ilbery. She was doing an executive MBA at the Graduate School of Business in Cape Town, and her thesis was on scenario planning, and she showed it to me before she submitted it to her professor. It was such a good document, I said to her, forget about the thesis, Chantal, we must collaborate on a book. And it took us 5 months, and we published it in June 2001, and it was called The Mind of a Fox. Now, why did we choose that title? Well, we wanted to distance ourselves from virtually every single American and European management textbooks written since the Second World War, because all those books are based on the hedgehog concept. What are foxes and hedgehogs? Well, there was a great British philosopher called Isaiah Berlin, who in the middle of the last century wrote an essay called The Hedgehog and the Fox. And he wasn't talking about animals, he was talking about people. He said, on the one hand, you have people who think that life is around finding the big idea, concentrating on that idea, rejecting all information that is inconsistent or irrelevant to that idea, and through sheer single-mindedness becoming a success. And he quoted Proust as a successful hedgehog and Einstein. But if you think about it in business, that approach has been taken over lock, stock, and barrel. Because in business, you have to have a vision, which is the big idea. You have to support it with a mission statement. And then you have to align everybody to the vision. And indeed, if you read the current American Bible on management called Good to Great by Jim Collins, he devotes a whole chapter to the hedgehog concept, where he says you're only going from being a good company to a great company if you actually think like a hedgehog. Now, we're prepared to accept that you have to have hedgehogs in companies, but you also have to have foxes. Foxes are people who do not give religious significance to a single idea. They're constantly juggling different ideas, and as the environment changes, just like the animal, they're looking at the opportunities and threats, and they adapt their thinking, and more importantly, they adapt their behavior. And it's their speed of response that ensures their survival. And I guess the one person who would totally agree with us would be Charles Darwin, who was born just over 200 years ago. Because when he wrote Origin of the Species, in the original edition, he used the phrase survival of the adapted. In other words, survival of the species who adapt to the changes taking place in nature around them. And it was only in the 5th edition, when his friend Herbert Spencer said, that's not a very attractive expression, change it to survival of the fittest, that he did so. And it was a big mistake, because most people think survival of the fittest means survival of the strongest, survival of the people who go to Virgin Active. And actually, survival of the fittest means survival of the species who most fit in with the changes taking place in nature around them. And that is precisely what we mean by foxes. And if you think about it, most species have lasted millions of years because nature changes quite slowly. Whereas in business, think of how many companies have survived beyond 20 years, 50 years, 100 years, 150 years. In fact, I know of only one company in South Africa that's lasted longer than 150 years, and that's Old Mutual. So, you know, the business environment changes a lot more dramatically, a lot more quickly than nature, and therefore you have to have this ability to adapt. And that is what we stress in The Mind of a Fox, that there are things beyond your control, and life is uncertain, and that as these changes happen, so you have to adapt. And there are two kinds of changes. We called them in the book the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns. The things you know you don't know, and the things you don't know you don't know. And yeah, through scenario work, you try and figure out the known unknowns, And obviously, you have to be prepared for unknown unknowns. Anyway, when the book came out, it wasn't hugely successful. I mean, it wasn't like the Da Vinci Code. But then something happened which turned it into a massive hit. And it was the #1 selling book in South Africa of any title in 2002. And in 2003, it was #2 because Harry Potter was #1. So what was the event that precipitated it into the bestsellers? It was 9/11. Because what we decided to do in the book was to try and convert George Bush into being a fox, even though we recognized that he was a 24-carat hedgehog. And so we wrote this letter to him in which we said, as a fox, you should prepare for some extreme futures. And by the way, Mr. President, the biggest uncertainty you face is a massive terrorist strike on a Western city, which will completely transform your presidency and possibly lead America into a gilded cage scenario. And it happened 3 months after we published the book. And when the Americans did a literature review, ours was the only book written anywhere in the world that in a letter to the president said that was his biggest, threat. Slightly different to Sum of All Fears, which fictionalized it. We said that was a real threat because of the re-equipping of terrorist groups in the 1990s and reorganization in places like Saudi Arabia. We said they now had the capability of attacking Americans on American soil, not just embassies in Africa, Americans on American soil. So, yeah, thank heavens we didn't get it exactly right in the letter. We didn't have planes flying into buildings. Otherwise, I wouldn't be in this auditorium. I'd be in Cuba. We talked of somebody planting a nuclear device in the middle of an American city. In other words, we talked of nuclear terrorism in the letter. But as my mentor, Pierre Wack, once said, and he was the best scenario planner of all time, he worked for Royal Dutch Shell during the 70s, he said, it's much better to be vaguely right than precisely wrong. And that's what you're trying to do as a fox. You're not trying to get the future exactly correct. Nobody can. But you're just trying to get the future more correct than hedgehogs, and certainly more correct than your competitors. So, obviously, with that coup in the book, people asked us to start helping them with their strategies. And I think to date, Chantal and I, over the last 10 years, have done about 650 strategy sessions with all kinds of organizations, in which we use the methodology of looking at the environment, looking at how the environment is changing, and then seeing how you as a business have to adapt to the changes in the environment. So we're not trying to supplant strategic planning at all. What we're trying to do is road test your strategic plan and see if it is viable under different scenarios. So, yeah, we've certainly, in the last 2 years, had this incredible increase in our popularity because of the discontinuities that have taken place. I mean, at the moment, we're going through the economic equivalent of an ice age with the mass extinction of business species. And, yeah, this is the moment that scenario planners are very popular. We've written 2 subsequent books. The second book we call Games Foxes Play, because we like to portray business as a game. I mean, it's, you have competitors, you have rules, you have uncertainties, you have outcomes, you win, you lose, you draw, you make money, you lose money, you break even. We like to use that metaphor during the conversation. And then the third book that we published in November 2007, we called Socrates and the Fox, because we find the best way to get companies to think imaginatively about the future is to question their existence, which is exactly what Socrates did with Athenians 2,400 years ago. He didn't ask sort of trivial questions. He said, why do you exist? Well, that's exactly what we ask companies. Why do you exist? And has the environment changed to the point that actually you are no longer relevant? So we don't go into operational plans and budgets and things like that. We ask you, why do you exist? And then we have a conversation, and we look at different scenarios to see whether, in fact, you should be changing your product offering in any way to improve the relevance of your existence.